This resource is called Constructive Deliberations. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, explain exactly what's in it, and talk a little bit about how you might use it. So where did this come from? Well, it originated with a symposium series that I organized for SFU with a couple of colleagues, Hugh Finlayson and Charlie Naylor. Hugh Finlayson was previously the Chief Executive Officer of the school's BC Schools Employers Association, which made him the chief negotiator for the government with the BCTF. And Charlie Naylor was the chief researcher for the BCTF, who recently retired. Hugh now teaches at BCIT, and Charlie's doing independent work. The three of us have known each other and are friends, and we thought that we might bring complementary perspectives to a symposium series that would help people to deal with the sometimes toxic environment that undermines our best attempts to communicate and collaborate in schools. So we did that a couple of years ago. We developed a series. We had a bunch of Lower Mainland districts bring teams that usually consisted of a union executive and a couple of senior people from the board office and a couple of administrators from schools. And that was well received, so we decided we would do it again. And we started that last Saturday, actually. During the course of that series, we developed a bunch of resources for the symposium series, and when we were finished, that looked like it might be a reasonably cohesive toolkit. So over the summer, we revised it into toolkit form and then posted it on BetterEducate, and the BCTF is also hosting it on their Teach BC website. It's free and available for anybody who discovers it to use it in any way they want. And what I'm going to do is explain to you how I think you might use it. So what is in it? Well, actually, posted online is one single PDF file, but that PDF file contains within it a table of contents of 32 other files, each of which are hot linked. And those files reside on my Dropbox so that I can update them and correct typos and make improvements at any time. But all you need is the single file with the hot links. Primarily, what you link to are very short files, one page. They're intended to be brief, snappy files that could be used as discussion starters in a variety of contexts. They aren't long, extensive considerations of things. They're intended to be easy to read and quick. A couple of them are longer. They provide the big picture framework for the smaller ones, but the things I'm going to introduce you to today are all short discussion starters. And what is this for? Well, they address some of them, understanding some of the complexities of communication. When we started this project, it was a response to the specific problems in communication that come from a long history of animosity and argumentation between the provincial government and the union. But in fact, communication at all levels is always complex. Even the most well-intended and competent people who want to do something well can fall into the pitfalls of miscommunication. That's why all of us are talking about active communication and paraphrasing and so on all of the time. So these files should not be seen as something that will fix a toxic situation, though they might be helpful if that's the case, but rather as something you can use to improve on what I hope are already good communications and make them excellent. It provides some strategies to enhance the quality of discussions along with the general understanding of the complexities, and also specific files intended to build capacity for dialogue, which is a very specific form of communication with a very specific purpose. So how might you use these files? Well, you could read them yourself for personal and professional development, and just to remind yourself of some of the issues of communication and some of the ways that it might entrap us and some of the ways we can improve it. But you could also do that with others, perhaps in a study group mode. A group of vice principals who are working together might use these files for a series of discussions and then perhaps try to apply them in their work. It could be used as discussion starters with a group that wants to improve its discussion. I mean, that could be a staff meeting, but it could also be a task force of some sort, or a Pro-D planning committee, or any kind of group that wants to improve its discussion and thus its effectiveness. And they can also be used in a currently contentious relationship. If people realize that they're not getting along as well as they'd like and they're not communicating as well as they like, finding some common purpose by reading these files and appreciating that communication is a partnership and you have to work together on it might be a way for them to take their desire to improve relationships and put some action onto that. I could see these files being useful in a grievance process, for example. So exactly what are the files? Well, here is the table of contents from the introductory file that I said you can download. I'm going to look at the various sections of this one by one. The first set of files, which are now in blue, describe the overall structure, the conceptual structure of the seminar series, and it's not probably the section that will be most useful to you. You might well want to look at these files, you might find them interesting, but they are not the ones that I specifically think you might use, as I said, those short discussion starters with an interested group. But let me introduce you to the overall structure, just so you know where the toolkit comes from and how the pieces go together. We use this diagram to try and explain to people the phases of a decision-making process. It starts on the left-hand side with the normal discourse in your school, and the distance between the two lines is intended to suggest that there's a range of opinions and views within a healthy discourse in a school. But every once in a while, a problem arises or an opportunity arises, and then we have to change our normal discourse a little bit. The first thing we do is that we broaden the discourse, and hence the two lines fly apart. So there's a divergent search for options and possibilities. Sometimes people call that brainstorming. We thought of it as a divergent dialogue for the purpose of understanding things. And then once you have broadened your discussion to sort of examine a range of possibilities, you have to start to choose amongst them and say, well, what would work for us, all of us, not for one party or the other, but what would help both of us move forward? And we called that finding integrative potential. And then eventually you have to realize that you cannot accommodate all of your differences. You can't find a win-win or a third way for everything. And so there are some unresolved differences that have to be dealt with in a debate-like manner, where you put forward your best argument for a position and then someone has to decide which path to take. Eventually you arrive at the point of decision, and it's a yes, no, a go or no go, and then you go back to your normal range of discourse during an enactment process. Now, to explain that to people, we talked about three different modes of communication which occur in the course of a decision-making process. The first is dialogue. And the term dialogue is commonly used. People throw it into the conversation as if it meant the same thing as a discussion, but of course it doesn't. Dialogue is a very specific form of communication, first introduced by David Bohm, who was a physicist going through a midlife crisis when he discovered the world was not fully deterministic, but a little bit more complex than that. And together with an Indian mystic and psychologist as well, Krishnamurti, they developed this specific way of talking with other people, which was a dialogue. And in a dialogue, you suspend your judgment, you listen with curiosity, purely for information, and you don't worry about a decision or the direction of a conversation. You simply, in a very open and responsive way, attempt to understand what other people are thinking and why they're thinking it. The integrative potential is a dialectic conversation, which becomes more analytic because you're trying to find solutions. And then the closing section is debate, which is the most familiar of the three forms. Now, I don't propose to go into that model in any detail because that would take more time, and it doesn't get us to the points of the toolkit that I think might be of actual use to you in the day-to-dayness of your work. However, I do want to note that this process, which looks like it would be how you might negotiate a collective agreement or resolve a grievance, and in fact, that is exactly how I think you would do it, can be scaled right down to the brief conversations that you have with individuals in your building. But to do that, you have to extract from this framework the basic principles. And that would be that in a normal conversation, which is trying to snatch an opportunity or solve a problem, you begin by suspending your judgment and just listening to try and understand things. And then if you try to fill in any gaps in your knowledge by asking questions of the other person, or maybe the two of you may go away and search out some knowledge that addresses a question you both hold. Then we have this conflict resolution process of getting beneath our positions to understand our interests. And once we understand the interests that underlie our positions, we look for ways that can satisfy everyone's interests as much as is possible. Ideally, everybody would be totally satisfied, but in fact, you can't usually reach that perfect state. And so you have that debate process that remains. And then someone has to make a decision on the best information available, explain the decision to other people, and then monitor the implementation and respond as you go. So that brief scaling, which begins importantly with listening for understanding before you jump into problem-solving mode, is applicable at all levels. So those blue titles relate primarily to that larger process, and so I'm going to remove them from consideration and focus instead on the balance of the toolkit, which are the short discussion pieces that I think you might actually find that you can use. So the first set is about the universal nature of communication. And you'll see there are 6 titles there, plus frames of reference, which is remaining from that middle section that I had removed. Perception is reality, as I think the basic understanding one has to bring to communication. The other files add commentary on some of the pitfalls that can trap us, even when we're well-intended. Groupthink, that's very familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. And the others, emotional hijacking, anchoring, keeping an open mind, and the double bind of intelligence, are one-page statements of some other psychological pitfalls that can sneak up on us. The perception as reality file is a couple of pages long, but here's the first page just to give you an idea of what a file in this context would look like. You'll see there's a simple diagram that talks about how a speaker's intention turns into a listener's perception, and there's a brief commentary about the consequences of that. One of the other files in there is keeping an open mind, and you'll see it is less than a full page. So a group could read this in, I think, 5 minutes maximum, and then perhaps just respond to its contents, and that would serve to heighten their awareness of a universal challenge of communication, and thus perhaps enable them to communicate better because of that heightened awareness. So there's a set of files there about the universal nature of communication. Another set of files within the group is specific processes for helping us to improve our communication. You know, even if we know that communication is a partnership, that it's complex, that there are many pitfalls that people can fall into and that we do fall into subconsciously and without knowing it, that in itself helps you to communicate better. But you also need some very specific strategies. And one of the things that you can do is get a facilitator to help you, but that's not always possible and not always warranted. So a few other simple strategies are suggested here. Using a talking stick. This I've found to be a very powerful strategy. I think everybody knows about it. It's not new, but sometimes they don't use it because they think, oh, we don't need it. You know, we're intelligent adults. We talk to each other all the time and we have a good relationship. So why would we use a talking stick? Well, even in the best relationship, even with people who meet and talk all the time, a talking stick I have found to be a very effective and useful strategy. It's simple. It doesn't extend the conversation, but it ensures that everyone has an initial voice in the conversation. I often use the talking stick not for the full conversation, but just to get started so that everybody can sort of make an initial statement of what they're thinking or feeling or wondering about before you jump in. Because once you jump in, you're smack in the middle of a conversation that can encounter all of the pitfalls. Other strategies here are using a final word discussion, a text discussion protocol, or a silent write. And silent write is another one of those, I think, very common but very effective strategies. It can be used before you start to talk. Once a situation or a question has been introduced, give people 2 or 3 minutes to just quietly write to themselves. And that's front end loading their thoughts so that when the conversation begins, they're not just following the first person to speak, but they have themselves some ideas to share. And it can be used at the end of a process to reflect on what happened and think, well, how did we do in this conversation? What did I learn? What remaining questions do I have? And then perhaps share them with the group. So those are very simple strategies, but often forgotten. And I think a one-page introduction of them and their purposes, perhaps combined with, at an earlier point, looking at some of the files about the universal nature of communication, might help you in some situations, perhaps a staff meeting, as I said, or a school-based team meeting, or some other task force. The final set of files here relates specifically to dialogue. And they're, I think, useful for all people because while everybody uses the word dialogue, most people fail to think about its very unique meaning. The key to dialogue, the starting point for dialogue, is the ability to suspend judgment. And oftentimes people think, well, I'm not being judgmental. I am listening. Look at me. I'm not talking. Therefore, I must be listening. But in fact, of course, listening means a lot more than not talking. So thinking together about the fact that we are all prone to tend to lapse into a debate mode and to prejudge and sort of to wait for the other person to breathe so we can jump in with our important point. That awareness can in itself, I think, help the quality of conversations that people have. Those files are all short and easy to read, and I think quite illuminating, except for the green file. That's illuminating, but it's longer. It's about 4 pages long. In fact, I assigned that to my master's students to do a self-assessment of their capacity for dialogue before our next class. So it's worth reading, but it's not an example of a one-page discussion starter. So that's an overview. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that you actually download a single file. So let me show you what that single file looks like. It's 3 pages in length. This is the first page, which says nothing more than what I have just said. This is the second page, which talks a little bit about how you might use this. One of the ways, as I've said, is exploring the complexities of communication. Another way is simple strategies for improving discussion. And another way is understanding dialogue in particular. The last set is if you actually wanted to dive into the framework, the overall framework, and look a little bit more closely and in more depth, which you might do in a study group mode, but is unlikely to be something that a staff would like to look at or a task force. This is the table of contents as you would actually see it. Each underlined element is a hot link, as I say, that takes you to a place on my Dropbox, and from there you can download the file as a PDF and keep it forever. But the only one you actually have to keep is this file you're looking at. Now, back on the other page, I'll go back and point out that I may change this file from time to time. For example, I expect we will add files to this set in the course of this coming symposium. And if any of you thought, gosh, I'd like to have a one-pager on this or that strategy or issue in communication, I'd be happy to talk to you about it and perhaps write that and add it so that we can be constantly updating and adding. If you click where it says here, it'll always take you to the latest version of this introductory file. So you'll have an updated table of contents and all of the hot links and have access to any new files or revised files that we may add. So that is the end of my brief introduction, and now I'm ready to sort of respond to any inquiries that you might have. As Kevin gets ready to pose those for me, I just want to reiterate that, well, actually, I'm not reiterating it. I failed to say it when I went through, but this set of files comes from a seminar series where we look at a framework in some detail. For you, I'm hoping that you will be able to use them in creative ways, individually or in small sets, in some setting where there is a communication occurring and you'd like to see if you couldn't leverage that communication, either to rescue it from the edges of dysfunction, perhaps, but more likely that it's okay, but it's not as good as it could be, and you just like to strengthen that communication, and therefore the quality of the decisions or the actions that come out of the conversation. How you might do that, I'm not entirely sure. I've suggested to you a couple of ways, but I'd be very interested to know if you actually use these, and if you do so, how you use them, and whether or not that works. So I strongly encourage you to communicate with me, to send me an email at any time about anything. You can ask me about what I've just said. You can ask me about a specific file. You can tell me what you've been doing or talk to me about how you might do it. Or you could suggest that something be added to this toolkit that would be actually more useful to you. I would be very interested in any such question, suggestion, invitation. So at that point, I'm going to be quiet now and let Kevin pose some questions.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and for the comprehensive overview and your suggestions and use of the toolkit. So just a reminder for BC PVPA members, Bruce does have a profile on BetterEducate. You can view this toolkit through BetterEducate, and further to your point, Bruce, in terms of getting some feedback, when you click on the actual file itself, there is an opportunity for you to put in a few bits of text in terms of some feedback for Bruce. I know that you're looking for some feedback on the use of this as well too. So that's one way you can give your feedback to Bruce in terms of your thoughts on the toolkit or how you're using it, or some suggestions for other things that you'd like to see. So Bruce, we have some questions coming in the question box, but I'm curious if you don't mind going into a little bit more detail in terms of, particularly for staff meetings and contentious issues that will arise at staff meetings. Do you have suggestions about a particular tool within the toolkit, how to manage that effectively on the part of the principal or vice principal?
Yeah, well, I think with communication, like with most things, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So ideally, you can get out in front of this kind of an issue by gently suggesting to people that, you know, a staff meeting is a great place for us to talk to each other. We don't get enough opportunities. So in our staff meeting, we're not going to have any information dumps. We're only going to bring to you those things that would benefit from our sharing our understandings, our perceptions, our interests, and our concerns. And because that opportunity is so important, we'd like to make it as effective as possible. So if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the nature of communication and some of the issues that may arise. And this file, Perception is Reality, is the door opener for that. People often hear that, you know, perception is reality, but they don't know what it means. And what it means is that what you say isn't really important. It's what people hear that counts. And people don't hear what you say. They hear what they interpreted you to have said. So this brief introduction, I think, would invite people to open their minds to that fact, and to that then perhaps they become more receptive to the possibility of looking at some specific files. Mm-hmm. In the first set, under context, one of the ones that I think might be interesting would be the issue of keeping an open mind, which points out that it's impossible to keep an open mind. We are all biased and blinkered by our past experiences and our apprehensions and our aspirations for where this conversation is going to lead us. So it takes effort. Another one would be groupthink, which encourages people to realize that expressing a different opinion is not negative, that one of the traps is if people feel too close to each other and too concerned about relationships, they may voluntarily suppress their doubts. And when that happens, then the quality of our thinking is diminished. Mm-hmm. So my general thought would be to raise this issue, perhaps personally, not as a criticism, but as an observation that all communications are difficult, and the staff room opportunity is so precious, we want to maximize it. So with your indulgence, we might read something and talk about it. I've run a short workshop for administrators, which seems to go well, by taking 3 or 4 of these files, like the double bind of intelligence, keeping an open mind, anchoring, emotional hijacking, take 3 or 4 of those and do a jigsaw, which takes, you know, maybe half an hour. But sort of opens the door to the whole lot. And if you had more time, you might do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Bruce. Our next question, would you recommend a particular framework or tool for having a challenging conversation with one person, not with a group of people?
Yeah, well, I think the model that I showed you can apply to with one person. Now, you may not want to show them the picture, which might sort of scare them because they think it's too complicated. But after the model that I showed you the how it scales. Um, but I would simply say to people, what I found is that when we have discussions about things that are complicated or complex or high stakes, or even where there's just some emotion, too often we jump into problem solving before we've really made sure we fully understand each other. So I'd like to suggest that I begin not by responding to what you just told me, but by asking a few questions and inviting you to just round out my understanding of what it is that you're presenting. Until you can say back to somebody what they have said to you in a way that they agree is exactly what they meant, they're unlikely to be willing to proceed because they still think that you have a hidden agenda or you're not really listening. So admitting that up front and saying, I'm going to ask a few questions and invite you to clarify, and then paraphrasing back to them until they say, yeah, that's what I mean. Then you can proceed, and I think acknowledging for people that your intention is to find a way forward which accommodates their concerns to the maximum extent that you possibly can before you begin to make any decisions about yes and no, perhaps invites them to be part of the whole process.
Just one final question, Bruce, and I guess it relates to that staff meeting piece as well too. So setting the norms for the protocols for discussion early on in the school year, I think is always a helpful thing to do. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that from the school leadership context in terms of setting those norms at the very early in the school year that will help facilitate positive conversations when you run into difficult and contentious issues throughout the year.
Well, yes, I agree. And so the file that discusses that is establishing group norms. And in fact, this is the first thing I do with the master's cohort because the quality of conversation amongst the cohort is a large determinant of the quality of their learning. And we open up by posing some simple questions like, basically, what would make this the best experience possible? What would help you to learn, and how do you think you can help other people to learn? Then they brainstorm and we write things on the board. But eventually, we write down a set of norms, which are all predictable and really indisputable. Like, we'll come to class having read stuff and being ready. We will listen attentively. We will make sure we leave space for other people. If we feel that someone has said something with which we disagree, we'll first ask a question before we jump in and critique it and that sort of thing. It's all just about being an intelligent participant in the conversation. But by surfacing them explicitly and then writing them down and distributing them to people, and I put them back up on the board at the beginning of every class to remind everyone, it really, I think, helps us to move forward in an intentional way towards a cohesive, collaborative, and interdependent group of learners. So in a similar way, I think at a staff meeting, you might say, we'd like staff meetings to be the best that they can be in our discussions. So let's just for a moment think about what is it that will make our discussions the best they can be, and from that generate a set of norms that everybody can agree to. I usually prepare them as a draft, send them around to the class and say, we're going to talk about this again next week. You think about it in the meantime, and if there's anything in here that you don't understand or you'd like to add or modify, let's do that before we finalize them. And maybe a staff can take ownership of the norms that they aspire to meet. And then through the year, it's useful every once in a while, maybe at the end of a staff meeting, to sort of throw the norms up and say, why don't we take a few minutes and just have a silent write and see to what extent did we achieve these, and then allow people to say, has anybody got any thoughts on what we could do at the next staff meeting that might help us to do even better, something of that nature.
That's very helpful, Bruce. And so I'm just keeping my eye on the time. We are coming to the end of our webinar. So any final comments, Bruce, before we close?
No, I think, well, yes, I guess the final comment would be that I'm hoping that these short files can be useful to people because I know they have been useful to people in our seminar series. They've told me that. But exactly how someone would use them in a school setting, I don't know. And I'm hoping that by putting them out there freely available for people to use or modify or take extracts from or do anything they wish with them, that I can learn more about how they might be useful and that I'll get some feedback that will help me to help others to use it well, but also to enhance the toolkit by adding or revising or amending it in some way. So really, I'm hoping that the people who are participating today will become part of the project and help me to make this toolkit more useful.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned to you last week, our registration for this webinar was quite high. I think it really speaks to the fact that people are looking for those sort of helpful communication tools, and I'm hopeful that our participants and others, when we post our webinar, will really take advantage of the powerful toolkit that you put in BetterEducate, and will also offer some of their own feedback, particularly in how that works from the school leadership context. And so with that, I want to thank Bruce for all of his work and making some time for us today. And thank you for your participation as well. As I said, I will give you access to this slide deck at some point this week, and we'll also post a recording of our webinar on our BC PVPA YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to bring our webinar close. Thank you again to Bruce, and thank you to all of our participants. Have a great day, everyone.